This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the Sports and Society podcast. This episode focuses on exploitation and harm that college football players experience. The episode directly addresses Chapter 6 on violence and abuse, Chapter 14 on school sports, but also Chapter 8 on race and ethnicity, and Chapter 9 social class, and Chapter 11 sports economy. It covers a lot. And we have two incredible guests to help us with this episode. We have Derek Silva, who's a professor of sociology and criminology at King's University College, where he teaches on sociocultural studies of sport, crime, and inequality. We also have Nathan Kalman-Lamb, who's an associate professor of sociology at the University of New Brunswick, where he teaches on social theory and sport. That sounds like me. Together, they are co-authors of The End of College Football, On the Human Cost of an All-American Game, and co-hosts of the End of Sport podcast. Derek and Nathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
It is absolutely our pleasure. So let's jump in with the first two questions we ask all of our guests. And I don't know who wants to go first, but whoever wants to go first, Derek, please describe your experience in sports.
Yeah, I'm a Canadian, grew up as a hockey fan playing hockey, but also my father was a Portuguese immigrant. So I was also very into football or soccer. So I also played soccer, and most of my childhood and early formative years, in terms of like going to university and even into grad school, I was like what I would call a sort of, unapologetic consumer of all things sports. I was a huge sports fan of all Toronto area sports, and football as well, in terms of the NFL and college football. And I did not take my critical gaze whatsoever to my sports fandom, if you will. I just was consuming it. I used it as a way to like create community with friends, with family, to kind of connect with my father in terms of like when the World Cup came on, and various sporting events. And it wasn't really until I kind of went into the belly of the beast, if you will, and went to the University of South Carolina, where I did my PhD, and I saw the machine that was college football, and I experienced it firsthand. And the preface of our book goes into this in detail, where I actually saw a lot of the warts of this like weird marriage of sports on the one hand and higher education, that my sort of critical eye kind of was turned onto sports. So my experience, like generally, I would say like I do believe that sports can be this like good thing. I don't believe that sports are this good thing, if that makes sense. So that's how sport has influenced the sort of questions that I ask, because I think it has the potential to do all the things that we like to think it does. And what brought me into sports, connections with my family, connection with friends, learning about how to work together when you're on the field or on the pitch or wherever on the ice. And I just don't think it's doing that. When I actually open my eyes and I look around to the sports system that we've created and erected to support those good things, I don't think it's actually doing that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I oftentimes joke that if it wasn't for when before my father passed, if it wasn't for gardening, he and I wouldn't have anything to talk about in the NFL offseason. Because it was, just football was such a part of our relationship. And, and to your point about like what sports could be, I often tell students that critical sports scholars, we really believe in what sports can be, and we're trying to make that happen. Nathan, why don't you talk about your sporting biography?
Yeah, I don't want to be too redundant here because, of course, there are some similarities. Sport has played an enormous role in my life too, outside of my own professional work. I played, all manner of sports as a kid. The highest level I achieved was sort of like high school basketball. But, Toronto became a hotbed. Just to toot my own horn slightly, Toronto became a hotbed of basketball. And we're seeing that now in the NBA, right? All of these players who have come from Canada. When I was playing, it was like a little bit before that. But actually, it meant that it was very strong at that time because the players had not yet started going to the United States to fulfill their basketball sort of journeys. So they actually were still playing in Toronto, high school basketball. So I was playing against a lot of these guys that would then go on to play in U.S. colleges. So it meant a lot to me at the time. I also was a sort of semi-professional basketball referee in Toronto for a couple of years. And then I also played a lot of recreational sports as an adult, sort of after graduating from university. And I highlight that part in part because I like to talk about that as, in my view, almost the utopian version of sport, like that kind of adult recreational sport. It's pure pleasure. There's actually nothing at stake. There's like the competition is kind of what you want to make of it. And so, I always say to anyone who has ever been really involved in sports and if there's something that they like about it, they should keep playing into their adulthood, because that's actually where you can see like the kind of the pleasure that the child has in a fairly, like a 6-year-old child before they get into a high performance model. You can almost acquire that as an adult. Now, I was also, I would say, a huge, huge fan. I also connected with my dad and my brother over sports. Unquestionably, my dad, we were Canadian, but my dad went to the University of Windsor, which is, right across the river from Detroit. And so it turns out, became a huge University of Michigan fan. So in this weird way, I was a Canadian kid, but I was extremely tapped in to American college sports, from my own childhood. We cheered for the University of Michigan. I would watch all those Saturday. I had a very similar experience in that regard to a lot of, American young people who follow college football, college basketball, etc. But then, like Derek, I had the experience of ultimately coming to an American university. I was educated at Canadian universities, but then I taught at Duke for 6 years. And, everyone knows that Duke is obviously kind of at the epicenter of U.S. college sports, less so in football, obviously, but certainly in basketball. And that experience wasn't eye-opening from the standpoint of, oh, wow, I didn't know that they took sports so seriously at American universities. Like, I knew that. That's what I'm trying to say is like, I knew that intimately from my own childhood, but it's still different to see it up close, right? Especially when you've only had an outsider perspective of it, to see what the university actually looks like, what it's like to have those students in my classes. Because I was teaching writing seminars on social inequality in sport, labor in sport, and people at Duke would tell me, because Duke has this thing where they have their athletic department, it's a big deal, but then they don't academically study sports almost at all. Okay. And so there's like really no because I think that they think it's too lowbrow, basically, and they don't want to besmirch their pristine academic reputation by getting into sports. So what would happen is that I had all kinds of students who would say, we came to Duke for Ivy plus sports. That's why we're at the university. And so they were so excited to take my classes, and I had tons of athletes in my classes. And so we ended up having almost like a consciousness raising workshop really around what it was like to be college athletes. And I learned an unbelievable amount, just from those interactions with those students.
That's awesome. And you've both pretty much anticipated our second question, which is, how does this sporting biography influence what you study? So why don't we get right into what you study? And I want to talk, we're going to talk a lot about your book, The End of College Football. And one of the things you do there in that book is you reject the dictum that sociology is at its best when it describes what is, not what should be. So can you guys talk about what it means to engage in a science that takes a political stand?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first point that we have to really put out there is that all science is political. There's no possible way to understand even like capital S, like the most natural science, like the most law-based science you can imagine, is not free of political interference in a variety of mechanisms. Funding schemes, the ways in which people decide where they're going to publish, what they're going to research. All of these are political questions. They get their money from governments that have different political leanings. They decide based on a political milieu that they grew up in, how they will interpret the world and see the world, and then also do their science about that world. So like we reject from the basis that any science can be apolitical, if you will. So following from that, if all science is political, there's absolutely inherently nothing wrong with being overtly political in your science, in your quote unquote science. And we accept that as a starting point. The goal of sociology in my world has never been to just talk about the world, to explain and describe the world. Even in the orthodoxy of sociology, the mainstream American sociological tradition, it's commonplace to see recommendations at the end of a peer-reviewed journal article. If that's not political, like what are those recommendations? Are they just describing, or are they going beyond description and actually trying to say, this is how things do get better? In my interpretation, that is, finding or trying to get at a world that should be. So we just accept that, and we write from the basis. We bring in that political take right into the start of our research. We don't reject it. We talk to research participants about it. They understand every part of the research project is a political project. And I think that's as it should be. I think that strengthens the work rather than takes away from the work. There's a lot of discourse, even currently right now, about the role of politics in academia. And I think anyone who suggests that there is or there should be no political take in is just simply, they just have their nose in the sand. They're not looking at the realities of the political economy that is higher education, where everything can't be nothing can be separated from politics. And I think it's in the context of sport, this is particularly interesting because you see the same discourses talked about athletes. You see the same thing that people like traditionalists, if you will, very strong positivists, keep politics out of our science. They're also the ones that say shut up and dribble. They're also the ones that say keep politics out of sport as well. So I think in this case, particularly when you're talking about athletic laborers, both of our groups are political. They will always be political, and everything that we do is a political statement, and we should just embrace that in our science as well.
I'll just toss one more thing in there because I think they're covered it. But, for any students who are listening, and I taught writing 101, okay, at Duke. So this is like straight out of that playbook. Almost all scholarly work, really across disciplines in our universities, boils down to argument. Okay, it's about you making claims and then you're furnishing evidence to support the claims that you've made. And you do that successfully, you do that unsuccessfully, right? But that ultimately is what what all of our projects are. And so at the end of the day, you're assessing people not on whether or not they are making a claim, because that's absurd. Like you can provide a veneer where you pretend that you're not making claims and you're just describing the world, okay? Or you can be upfront, like Derek said, about the claims you're making. But the bottom line is we're assessing all academic work on the quality of the evidence provided. That's the bottom line. So don't get caught up in like the kind of, again, the veneer of the form that the claim occurs in. No, assess each and every scholarly intervention based on the caliber of the evidence provided. And that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I just want to add to that and make sure that the students understand that we're not just being woke here for the sake of being woke. We are starting with critical questions, and we're going through the scientific process. And if that leads us to a particular conclusion that is related to potential change, that's how we get there. And our science can be criticized. and that's the whole process that we are careful before we jump into the political scene to make sure that we have data that are backing us up. And that's the important thing.
Yeah, the one thing I would add also, and I bring this up in the classroom all the time, which is what is the origins of sociology in the United States? Who were the people that founded it? They were activists, whether they were progressive Protestant ministers or they were women involved in the settlement house movement. They weren't trying to describe the world as it exists. They were trying to change it. So this gets me to our next question. You've already brought political economy of college football up, and I want to talk about that more specifically. And the way that I think we can enter into this is Walter Byers' concept student athlete, which is still with us. People still use it all the time. You know, you'll hear people saying, oh, I love college sports because they're amateur sports, you know, unlike those professional athletes. So I want you to talk about this term student athlete, like where does it come from and how does it work to externalize key risks, particularly associated with football, so that it can insulate the football colleges, which actually, like in my writing, I refer to them as firms. And I think they're better understood as firms than schools. But yeah, so talk about this term, student athlete.
Absolutely. So I think the best way to answer this question is I will do the sort of socio-historical analysis of the term, and then I'll toss it to Nathan to talk about some of these sort of key risks and how it's kind of used to obfuscate a whole bunch of things. So Walter Byers, famous like the first executive director of the NCAA in the late 1950s, early 1960s, developed through a few different mechanisms this notion of student athlete. And this Walter Byers himself he's been deposed, he's written about this in his book. He developed this term explicitly to make it more difficult for football players who were injured on the field to make claims to workman's compensation, which pays out for injuries on the job. So Walter Byers viewed this as a legal mechanism to actually make sure that when players were injured, they were not treated as employees in the NCAA. There's a whole bunch of reasons why and motivations for why that was happening. At the same time, he was trying to increase or to get TV rights in the NCAA. He was trying to create this like monolith of the NCAA that's basically a monopsony of labor and a monopoly of the spectacle of college football, predominantly also college basketball, as we know. So he was building this kind of mass commercialization. And one of the threats to that mass commercialization was actually having to, treat athletic laborers as laborers, because often in the 1960s, these were just laborers. These were like hired guns by the Yales, by the Harvards to just come. They weren't actually students. So if they were students, they were like taking very few classes and almost like pseudo students, not full kind of full-time students as we understand them today. So he was trying to build this system, and the threat were actually having to pay these laborers, because what do you want to keep your labor costs low? And then 2, any liability for injuries that were inevitable in a violent game like football. Injuries are in some ways an existential threat. And we can see this even in discourse around chronic traumatic encephalopathy in the NFL and like doomsday scenarios about what that means for the NFL. But those are 2 big threats to that kind of mass commercialization. So Walter Byers was ahead of his time in seeing that and developed this concept to mask all of that. Importantly, Walter Byers eventually turned and flipped on the NCAA. And right before his death, he was deposed as part of the Ed O'Bannon case and a previous case. And he talked about how what he actually created was a massively corrupt system. He called it a nationwide money laundering scheme. Like what this kind of student athlete notion developed into, and a system that he created. And he was ultimately regretful about that. That's not to shine light on and say like he's great. because what he did was incredibly harmful. But he even acknowledged that the monolith, the machine that he created, was ultimately detrimental to athletic laborers. So I think Nathan can chat about a lot of the risks to quote unquote firms, which I actually like that you've articulated them as firms and not as universities.
I just want to throw one more little historical detail in there, which is the reason that buyers did that was because in the 1940s, the NCAA started, or the college firms started giving scholarships. And that was a means to control the athletic labor. But then that triggered this crisis that Derek just explained. Their solution to the crisis was more control over the labor. But go ahead, Nathan, please.
Yeah, well, just to elaborate this point a little bit, because I think already, you're both pointing to the fundamentals here. But for any business, for any firm, right? This is actually a question of like Marxism 101, because we have to understand that the way in which surplus value is produced by any business, and that's profit, okay? That's what we're talking about. The way in which and we will have to complicate this later when we're talking about firms and when we're talking about profits, because that is absolutely complicated in the context of college sport, but I won't get into that now. For this question, the fundamental way through which surplus value is produced is through the exploitation of the worker's labor power. We don't have to go deep on that, but the reason I'm saying that is this fundamental source of value production and also cost for any business is labor, right? It's the worker. That's what is so fundamental. And so if you can find a way of recoding or externalizing this labor that otherwise all firms are required to pay for, if you can turn it into this other thing, student athlete, which is in fact not the worker, okay? So suddenly you're not on the hook for paying the worker's wages is the real point I'm trying to make. Yet at the same time, the worker is still your worker. They're still working for you. They're still making the product that you are going to be selling, right? So you're getting all of the benefits of the process of surplus value exploitation, but you have none of the consequences, none of the risks, none of the cost, right? Because it has been externalized as a student athlete. And then the additional piece in the context of football that's so important, right, is that, of course, another problem for all, and this is a consequence, this isn't natural, it's a consequence of a long labor activism movement, right? So when Marx was talking in the 19th century about factories, he's talking about people dying at work, because there were no occupational health and safety protections in these factories. They were incredibly unsafe. Children are essentially being chewed up in the gears of in these factories. And workers fought well over a century, right, in order, through unions and other means, right, to get occupational health and safety protections so it was possible for them to survive their workday, right, as well as, make a living. And this is a big, big issue in the context of a sport like football. And Derek already mentioned this, but if we know that football systematically destroys people's brains, and we now absolutely and fundamentally understand this to be true, okay? It is not possible to play the iteration of American football that currently exists, which is to say full contact tackle football, the version we now have. We could hypothesize, could we play flag football? Could we do other things? That's fine. But the current version through which all the money is made cannot occur without life-altering harm. Okay, it's built into the sport. We actually are talking about people who are dying in front of us every single time we watch a football game. It's concealed by a helmet. It's concealed by time, actually, and the fact that it doesn't take place, like they don't literally die in front of us, right? The death happens down the road, but it happens much earlier than it would happen if they had not had these footballing experiences, okay? So there's a huge amount of health and safety risk built into football. And if the employer has to bear this risk because they're on the hook as an employer, that's a huge expense. But what Derek has explained is by this reclassification of the student athlete, then the employer wiggles out of that, of being on the hook for those costs as well. And I think, to me, those are the fundamental ways in which they're thus externalized. These are the costs that would be associated with the business that they're in, and they have found a way of not having to pay those costs even as they recoup all the benefits that they would otherwise receive as a professional football business.
Yeah, and let me add here that many of the universities that have football teams, high-profile football teams, also have medical schools. And I've wondered why an athletic department doesn't call over some of the experts on the human body and what this violent contact does to it, so that the athletes can become informed about what they're getting into, what they're doing, and make informed decisions. I'm not talking about a doctor coming over and saying, we got to drop football. I'm talking about give the athletes the information they need in order to make an informed decision in light of how they see the rest of their lives about their involvement in the sport.
Well, Jay, you open up a whole ethical can of worms there, okay? Because actually, one of my serious concerns about the way in which football is like the kind of football industrial complex operates on university campuses is that we have a couple things happening. One, we already have enough data that has been accrued, okay, that tells us definitively that this sport is associated with profound life-altering harm. At the same time, we actually do have people conducting medical research on these campuses. Okay, it is happening, including with the football team. But the medical research that they're conducting requires the football players to get hurt. Okay, which is to say, they literally are putting the monitoring equipment in their helmets, sending them on the field and saying, when you get a concussion, we'll get the data and we'll be able to say more about how much that concussion is hurting you. But since we already know that the concussion is causing life-altering harm, that means that the entire medical research project that's occurring is predicated on the sacrifice of a young person's, of a student who we're supposed to be developing and nurturing. That student needs to be sacrificed for the medical research to be conducted. And our IRB boards, that is the people on our campuses who are responsible for ensuring that all research that occurs is ethical and in accordance with basic research ethics, those research ethics boards are saying it's fine. Okay? If you do qualitative research and you ask them a question, and the question is like, did you ever have a bad experience? We're like, whoa, that's pretty harmful stuff. They might get a little worked up and have a little emotional trauma. Meanwhile, we're literally killing people for the purposes of research, and that is A-okay. And by the way, at the University of North Carolina, right, Kevin Guskowitz was doing exactly this kind of research, exactly what I'm describing. He has gone on to an extremely lucrative career as a president of multiple universities, because within the broader system of higher education in the United States, there apparently are no concerns whatsoever with what I've just described.
So I just want to say, since the 1890s, at least, people have known that injury and death is inseparable from college football. And this is something I talk about in Discipline and Indulgence, that the history of college football has been this like political dance between people being outraged by the violence and the gambling, the drug use, the excesses of college football, and then also regulating it so that it can continue in the essentially the same form. Because once you remove the violence from football, you don't have football anymore. I mean, like, I love flag football. I raised my kids. playing it. I coached it. But I know that flag football is not really a viable replacement in the United States to tackle football, because the violence is so central to the spectacle. And the history has been so much political work being done to protect that spectacle. But I want to get back to the issue of the student athletes. So one of the solutions, and you do address this in your book, has been the solution to this problem is calling campus athletic, calling campus athletic workers student athletes is in fact to identify them as workers, which you do in your book. And so that could force the firms to internalize these risks that they're currently externalizing. And just, if someone's not familiar with the term externalization, that's when there's a cost in a production process that the firm producing the commodity does not pay. It gets external to the production process. So somebody else is paying it. And in this case, it's the athlete, their family, their community is paying this expense. And so if they're workers, then they would be eligible for workers' compensation. And we have certainly seen movement in this direction, with athletes winning the right to collective bargaining. We see the NIL. We see some other developments as well. Can you two assess the strengths and limitations of these developments in terms of advancing the rights and justice for athletic workers?
Yeah, I think you have to preface this conversation with saying that name, image, likeness is a net positive for campus athletic workers. It's brought in a new era of college athletics, if you will, that to some degree, to the most minor degree, alleviates a heretofore denied right, which is to earn money from your labor. It does so. You've used the word externalization. I also, in this context, like what name, image, likeness is actually externalized is compensation to a third party rather than, and it actually further obfuscates any ability to treat campus athletic workers as workers. It actually makes it so they're not working for you. They're a quote unquote student athlete when they're on the field, but all of their other labor can be compensated in a traditional work employee-employer relationship, aka gig work. That I like to use the term gig work rather than externalization. It's brought in an era where athletes have to sell additional labor, whether that be time, signing autographs, whether that be showing up at certain events, whether that be posting on social media, which we've often seen. But that's additional work that your labor is being compensated by a third party. This is, to some degree, allowed another period of time where firms do not have to pay their employees directly because they've, this is what the hoopla that the college sport industrial complex or media industrial complex has like really bought into, that NIL, these athletes are making millions. They have the capacity to go get all this like new funding, and that's allowed them even more time to not compensate their labor. There's other developments that we've seen in terms of the House settlement, which I'll just tee up for Nathan. Perhaps Nathan can talk about some of that stuff. But I think that the limitations of this, it's basically that you are, or these firms are able to justify the continuation of this broader scheme of exploitation, of wage theft, of not paying athletic workers for their labor by externalizing it to private companies, which now supplement our high universities and our esteemed institutions of higher education. So they continue to like make money without paying them directly. One of the things that you mentioned that I just very briefly want to talk about is the right to collective bargaining, which we also should point out that is not a widespread right that has been given to athletic laborers. And in fact, there's been a lot of pushback against that, and we're seeing even more with this Trump administration pushing back against any attempt to treat campus athletic workers as workers specifically. There were a lot of developments around the previous general counsel to the National Labor Relations Board, Jennifer Abruzzo, who we've had on the podcast, released several memos that were opinions that were saying these are employees and athletic workers are employees that should be treated accordingly. That person was ultimately, that person is not in the role of general counsel for the National Labor Relations Board. And that has really whittled down in the last 2 years, even the discursive formation around unionization, around collective bargaining, and all of these things are intentionally limiting the power for campus athletic workers to both mobilize and to make their working conditions better, and have resulted in piecemeal advances that are beneficial for campus athletic workers. NIL is beneficial, the House settlement is beneficial, but they deserve so much more. That still has yet to happen. So they're net negatives, I think, for campus athletic workers.
Yeah. So look, this is a very confusing era to try to parse in terms of like how compensation operates in the context of college sports. So I'm going to try to just like provide like a brief, I don't know, 8-year recap. And the reason I'm kind of choosing that time is we started doing the work on our book in around 2019. The book came out in 2024. And over the course of the time that we were conducting interviews with former college football players, some of the players we spoke to then had participated in this sort of new era. Many players had participated in the previous era. So we were really getting a taste of a whole range of experiences around compensation in the context of college sport. Now, when NIL was first introduced, and what we had essentially was like Supreme Court ruling in the Alston case, and Kavanaugh, especially his concurrence, where he lays out like in shocking terms this very, very conservative justice, right? Who I would essentially say I do not agree with on pretty much any topic imaginable, and yet somehow he wrote words I would almost been glad to claim as my own in the context of college sport, right? By describing how exploitative the system is, even how racially exploitative the system is, and so forth. And by delivering that decision, he kind of opened the door for finally this move away from amateurism. We also had a case that California was pushing against this. There was legislation in California. Anyway, ultimately, we kind of the liberalization of name, image, and likeness that Derek described. And in its early form, that really was what Derek was describing, this kind of gig work piece where athletes were like literally doing, photo shoots and autograph appearances and so forth to make a little bit of money on the side. But what that quickly transformed into as the attempts by the NCAA to regulate NIL were ultimately defeated in the courts was essentially that we have these collectives, right? And people talk about collectives. We'll have the boosters who had previously been paying players under the table to play for their teams, because we know that money was changing hands historically, now could do it over the table, right? They were able to just work together in these collectives to offer what amounted to contracts for the athletes to come play for 1 year, paying them millions of dollars sometimes, right? Like in football, like some very, very large contracts. And so money starts flowing hands. Like now, as Derek said, it's still not the university who's paying that money. In this case, it's like these boosters associated with the university, but it's a lot of money. It got to the point where it was a lot of money and it was essentially pay for play. Then in addition to that, we also throw into the mix this house settlement that Derek's describing. And in the house settlement, one of the key terms of that settlement was that actually now the universities for the first time have to engage in actual pay for play, which is to say that the universities themselves have to directly compensate the athletes. There was a salary cap built into that, approximately $20 million a year initially. So this is a really fundamental change in the system, actually. Okay. But you'll notice that this is all a function of either legislation or principally court decisions. This has nothing whatsoever to do with collective bargaining. Okay, so we have to be super clear. Derek said this, but we have to be super clear about the fact there is no collective bargaining whatsoever. And another way of saying it is the players have no ability to impact the terms of their employment except by this very indirect means of making it like essentially launching cases in the courts and hoping that the courts will like change the rules in a way that is beneficial to them. But there's no way in which they are directly in conversation with the universities or politicians or anyone else about what they actually want, the conditions that they actually want. Okay. And so that's why I would ultimately argue, look, one of the huge benefits that has come from the kind of the change we've seen also the liberalization of transfers, which is so previously, right, a player who wanted to they would only be allowed to transfer once. If they transfer, they had to sit out an entire year. So it was a huge disincentive, which was basically pressuring or coercing players to stay with their current program. Now, as everyone is well aware who follows college sports, right, players are literally transferring every single year based on the enticement of a contract offer they're essentially receiving. And so there's huge player movement throughout the sport. This is good from an ethical standpoint, in my opinion, okay, because it means that we're diminishing the coercion, we're increasing the compensation. As Derek said, these are all beneficial things. However, if you kind of pay attention to any of the discourse around college sports, I can very confidently assure you most fans of the sport are not happy about this state of affairs because, in part, I think, we haven't talked that much about fandom at this point yet, but like one thing that fans do when they pay attention to sport is that they invest their identities in a team, right? They invest in the players who represent the team that they care about. And when a player is switching every single year, it's very difficult to develop those kind of parasocial relationships that are really core to sports fandom. So it's quite aggravating actually to think that like you might love this player and then immediately they're on another team. So like how much it starts to feel mercenary, right? And it's not wrong, I don't think, to say it does feel mercenary. You know who else would probably agree with that? All the actual professional sports leagues, which have been at this for decades and have been understood that, yes, we're going to pay our players, but also a model where the players are moving every single year is not in anyone's best interest. So we will offer them multi-year contracts that will be collectively bargained, and we'll work out a situation where both the players and the teams can be satisfied that it's like a fairly consensual employment relationship. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to say. Although we've seen benefits, I think we're not at a place that anyone is particularly happy, but we could easily get to a place where people were quite happy if we actually allowed unionization, collective bargaining, and a much more kind of coherent model.
Yeah, and I just want to add here that we're talking about Division I sports for the most part. And the majority of colleges and universities that are associated with the NCAA are in divisions 2 and 3. And I'm wondering, when it comes to collective bargaining, how would that work? Would it work just for Division 1? Which is those are the issues we're talking about right now. Is it difficult to have collective bargaining for college athletes when divisions 2 and 3 are also tossed into the mix because their issues are slightly different in certain cases than the D1 issues?
That's actually a great question, and I whenever I ponder this myself, I think of the broader labor movement. We have different scales of professionalization across every single sector of our economy. You'll have in healthcare, you'll have, say, nurses, registered nurses, and then you'll have doctors, brain surgeons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these people, for the most part, in many places, have at least a capacity to be in to collective bargain. I'm not saying all are unionized. That's not my suggestion, but all have the ability to be an employer-employee relationship, and it's different in terms of scale. They're contributing to similar things, and that the scale can be different. In the context of college football, I think the same thing can be true, particularly because I think campus athletic workers, even if they are not bringing in revenue, particularly when we're talking, or the same degree of revenue, particularly when we're talking about college football, the health risks, the working condition risks, they need more of a say in. So part of collective bargaining is not just about compensation. It's not just about revenue sharing, agreeing to contracts. It's also about having a say in your working conditions, about having a say in your safety and health and safety protocols, in reporting protocols, in engagement with other laws that exist, human rights laws, disability laws, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things come with collective bargaining. So when we're talking about collective bargaining, yes, compensation is a huge piece of that, but it's not the only piece. So I think the compensation question can be handled differently in terms of different scales, where you've got FBS, then you have FCS, then you have Division 2, all those, that can be worked out in an employee-employer relationship. But the first step is allowing that to happen. And then those things can and will be dealt with in collective bargaining. That's the history of unionization across North America. It's like, oh, we can't unionize, and then and then everybody unionizes, or like a bunch of people unionize, and they all have their own collective agreements. And I think it can be very similar in this context.
I mean, to your point, I think that a lot of, probably most labor organizers would say bosses don't oppose unionization primarily because they don't want to pay more, which of course they always want to pay as little as possible. It is giving power to workers to actually be able to define the conditions under which they work. They don't want the inmates running the asylum, right? That's their main fear. And secondarily, they don't want to pay more. But this also, you brought up the portal and the liberalization of transferring. Well, there was an executive order about this recently, and it was informed by people like, what's his name? Saban. I'm blanking on his first name. That used to be the coach at Nick Saban. Thank you, Coach.
Nicky Saban. Yep.
Yeah, coach at Alabama. Can you talk about this reaction to workers being empowered? Right? Because, and all we're talking about here is applying market principles to labor, not just market principles to management, but market principles to labor, so that workers can choose where they're going to work and therefore have more strength negotiating with their employer. So yeah, can you talk about this reaction that we've seen?
Yeah. So look, you're getting to the crux really of capitalism itself, okay? Which is that we have the kind of superstructural, or we have this sort of ideological, this image, this idea that capitalism is a system of freedom, right? That's the idea. That's the term liberal. It means free liberalism, which, by the way, despite the very confusing American discourses around what liberal means, right? The United States is a liberal society in a classical sense, right? Including MAGA folks are actually liberals. They just don't realize it in the American discourse, okay? And that they believe in the free market as the kind of guiding force of their society. And the myth associated with that is we are all individual actors. We're all actually self-interested agents in the world. And if we all pursue our own self-interest, we'll maximize the productivity of society. We'll maximize our own well-being. Everything will be good for everyone. And we just have to create as much freedom as possible in order to allow for this wonderful society to occur. Okay. And certainly coaches like Nick Saban love that principle when it's attached to themselves, to coaches, right? That coaches want to be able to leave and pick up and go to another job every year and this or that. They don't want to have any ties to them. That's all true. Okay. But when it comes to the realities of capitalism, all right, this entire supposedly free market system is based on the opposite of freedom. It is based on coercion. The coercion of workers to feel the necessity to sell their labor for a wage. Okay, to be a proletarian, to be a wage worker, and to sell your labor for a wage is not a lucrative thing to do. It is not a way, despite the myth of the American dream that you will pull yourself up by your bootstraps and one day become a capitalist. Okay, this is not the reality of how capitalism actually operates. To be a wage worker is to subsist, and subsistence means not accruing more surplus, and you need a surplus in order to be a capitalist. So if you're just subsisting, that means you're just surviving and you will never become a capitalist. Okay, but all the profit made in capitalism is predicated on hiring wage workers, putting them to work, and then taking the surplus for the capitalists themselves. That's how capitalists make more money and become, Elon Musk at the end of the day or whatever. So this is a terrible situation for the wage worker, right? There's no reason why anyone would want to sign up for this willingly. Why are people doing it? It is because of what we might characterize as structural coercion or systemic coercion. And we can look at the history of capitalism in Europe, for instance, and look at them. This is why, students are like, what? Because I'm teaching about this all the time. Students are always like, why are we talking about feudalism again? Spend a lot of time talking about feudalism, but you have to understand the system that came before to understand the system that comes after, right? And what happens, and I won't go deep on this, but like what happens there in the grand scheme is that the workers who were once serfs, who were making their subsistence living on tiny little agricultural, their tiny little agricultural plot of land. They were farming. They were getting just enough to survive. But if you take away that plot of land, now that worker has two choices. They can die or they can migrate to the urban areas where there are now these new things, factories, where they are offering a wage to survive. And of course, any human being, when given a choice between death and survival, will choose survival, even if survival isn't that gratifying, right? And that's a good metaphor for capitalism in general, okay? Because that's what we see happening over and over again. And this is true also for the workforce of college football, right? So the teams, the universities, the coaches, they don't want their players to have mobility. They don't want them to have choice and freedom and so forth, because that's going to minimize their control over the entire operation. They want to have the maximum amount of control to squeeze the most value and production and performance they can out of players, right? And so they want to create the most coercive conditions possible. And what we just went through, we described how this has been kind of broken down, right? We have this sort of chaotic new environment where I didn't call it ideal, but I did say it's true that players now can transfer left and right based on who's offering them more money. And that's better for the wage worker because now they're possibly earning more wages because the actual myth of capitalism is becoming a reality for them, right? There's a real free market competition and they're accruing the value as a consequence. And so it's very telling that as soon as we see a pure form of the myth of capitalism kind of reified or concretized in reality, then the capitalist class is like, oh, no, that's not what we meant. Absolutely not. No, we didn't mean like real freedom for all y'all. We meant that for us. We need for you rules.
This is the whole reason that sports leagues were created to start with, in order for to rationalize a somewhat free market, which is chaotic, and when you have an unregulated market, a truly unregulated market, there are very few barriers to entrance. So lots of firms can enter the market, but lots of firms exit the market, and as a result, very few firms make much money. But that creates better conditions for workers. So starting with Major League Baseball, right? And then, the minor leagues of football that would eventually become the NFL and the NCAA and so on and so forth. Yeah, you see this firms regulating the market to stabilize it, to create barriers to entrance, and then, as Derek mentioned earlier, create monopsony labor relations. But hey, Jay, you jump in here.
Yeah, the athletes at all the levels are a little bit different than some other laborers because the sponsoring organization is a university or a college. And, we've always talked about, when we talk about athletes, you are in this to get an education and to play sports. So that makes them a little bit different than other laborers. And it seems that there's a responsibility on the part of the university to make sure that an education is a viable prospect when you either transfer in the portal or, when you're taking advantage of the portal or when you're doing practice to all summer and, spending a hell of a lot of time with travel and training and competition. So are athletes different than other laborers because of the organizational context within which their labor is being used?
I think that's a great question. And I think that actually highlights the insidious nature of this particular form of work and the expectations that we have with campus athletic workers. And what I mean by that is that our institutions, our universities are supposed to be institutions of higher education. They are supposed to their mission is to develop the minds of young people. That's what we do. That is our main objective. In the context of college football, that is literally the activity of football, the spectacle of football is antithetical to that mission. So having our universities not only endorsing it, but building this system of racialized wage theft that we've talked about thus far, that is intentionally damaging brains, damaging limbs, damaging the psychology of folks, damaging their well-being, is completely antithetical. It actually highlights the fact that what we've built here is incredibly harmful. So to answer your question, are these a different, is it a different relationship or a different? Yes, it is. It's actually in some ways a more dangerous one than many other employee-employer relationships because of the insidious nature of that. And it's done so. Many scholars use the term sports washing, which I know you've engaged in. It's done so through this cultural sports washing that's happening that makes people, and this is what Nathan has referred to as structural coercion, or part of the puzzle of structural coercion, that coerces young people into thinking that this is, one, okay, and two, should be like wanted and desirable. It's a desirable to some degree, and that's often the discourse that's used to further justify it from people who aren't in the system. When we ask athletes, is this a great system? Did you enjoy playing college football? Most of them are like, hell no. I was a good athlete. I would have rather gone and played basketball. I would have rather gone and played baseball. But I did football because that's where the potential was. And we as fans often contribute to that sports washing through saying they get the best on-campus experience. They are heroes on campus. They walk around as a football. They get all these cool, amazing amenities that other students just don't get. That's all like meaningless. They are treated like shit in their class. Or maybe I shouldn't swear. They're treated badly in their classes. They're treated and ostracized socially on campus. And they get a truncated version of the education that everyone else gets. They don't get their summer internships. They don't get their travel abroad programs. They can't actually do the schoolwork because they're doing an onerous, violent job 40 to 60 hours a week that they are completely exhausted from, and they can't go study. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they literally can't. How many, third year, like juniors or sophomores have to bash their head for 3 hours a day and then go do all these other things and then like take a test. Like it doesn't happen very often. And this peculiar type of athletic laborer has to endure all of those things. So I think, yes, it's different, but it's actually a negative form of difference that really negatively impacts campus athletic workers.
I really appreciate what you were saying there, Derek, because we've been talking at a very high abstract level so far. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, when I was in graduate school at the University of Southern California, I worked as a tutor in the Student Athletic Center. And at Tailback U, I exclusively worked with football players. And so I got to know a whole bunch of them. And this is the Pete Carroll era. We were winning national championships, producing Heisman Trophy winners. And, I talked to these guys, and a lot of them would tell me the same thing, which was in high school, football was all about fun. And they're like, when you walk out onto the field, it is still fun, but the rest of it isn't fun. We are bought and paid for. And like, I mean, literally, I think he was an offensive guard, starting offensive guard, said that to me. Can you go into a little bit more detail about the experience that these guys have on campus in these programs?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we have a new project in the works right now where we're talking to folks we're talking more about football through the life course at this point, as opposed to just focusing on college. So we're asking questions about, their experiences with youth football, high school football, college football, NFL football, and so forth. We're really trying to compare, and we're hearing exactly what you're describing from player after player, which is that even though, to be honest with you, we're hearing some very harrowing things about the earlier levels as well, but there's something, especially with high school football, and I think we should underline this, there's a way in which, and it's different regionally, but in a lot of parts of the United States, a whole community might revolve around the high school football team, right? There's a way in which like the community gathers on that Friday night, and it doesn't just start on Friday night. It's like the whole day, the players essentially celebrated at school. There's like a breakfast in the morning, there's events all through the day. And there's a sense that you're, because these are men, obviously young men, kings of the world, right? In this sense, that's who they're, kings of this community. And so, of course they find that pleasurable, right? For the most part, it makes perfect. If you're good and you're succeeding and you're a star, this human experience doesn't get that much more gratifying than being celebrated by an entire community, especially when you're a young person like that. And then they come to college, right? And this is the thing, is that the college football team is comprised entirely of people who were like them, right? Who were the stars of those programs. And the thing that they immediately notice is that, and this is why your language around firm makes perfect sense, right? Is that because they'll say, it's treated like a business. It's a business now. Once you come to college, it's a business, even though we're not paid like it's a business, but because the coach, it is a business for the coach, right? And that's a really important part of this. The coach knows that their job is predicated on winning, on results. They may even have performance benefits and so forth. So for the coach, every single thing that they're doing, even though we have this fiction, going back to what Jay said, that this is about, university and about educating and so forth. And that we could have, in a really idealistic sense, we might imagine how different is a coach than a professor, right? We're teaching different things perhaps, but we're all mentors, we're teachers. It's all part of the same project. In an abstract sense, I'd buy that. I could buy that. I'm not trying to say that one thing is more important than the other or whatever. If you are actually mentoring in that way, if you are actually teaching in that way, if that's your focus, then sure, these are part of the same kind of project. But that's not the reality of how it works in the world of college football, because the point of everything is to extract performance, right? And so that's why players feel this, every moment of their day is budgeted, right? So there's an immediate kind of alienation that comes from that, because they don't, we have this idea of the university experience for the average student as this time to come and find themselves, right? Learn who they are, experiment, that kind of language we often hear. And college football players cannot have that experience, right? The only people they're going to meet on campus principally are the other members of the team, because they have to spend all of their time together, right? Everything is regimented. The truth is, if they're going off to parties or doing this and that, they'll probably be disciplined for it, right? That's actually probably going outside of what the regulations allow for them to do. So, and then the additional piece is, you have to remember, at the college level, historically, because the player, and this is changing, which complicates it, but because players were not compensated for their time in college, everything that they were doing in college was an audition for the pros. And everything is at stake here. You've spent now, maybe 15 years of your life, because they could be starting playing football at 5 years old. Maybe something like 15 years of your life could have been spent honing your ability at this thing that, frankly, most of them, as Derek said earlier, don't necessarily find super pleasurable, right? They're good at it. They're big, they're strong, they're powerful, they may be very intelligent, they're, right? They are everything you would hope for in a football player, but that doesn't mean that they find it as pleasurable as other forms of sport that are much more playful and don't require this kind of violence and domination as a fundamental feature of the activity. Okay, so you've invested 15 plus years in honing your craft at a thing you may not even love, and you get paid for it or you don't get paid for it based on, are you on the field, right? Because this is a huge part. These rosters are enormous. We may have 100 plus people on the roster. Is there game tape of you or is there not? Because if there is no game tape of your performances, you don't exist. The NFL isn't scouting you, you don't exist. And all of those hours of football didn't happen, okay? And you'll never be paid for them, and you'll have all the consequences. So, think of the pressure in that, the stakes. You must get on the field. You must perform, right? It all comes down to that. No one would find that to be fun. Even the ones who say, though, by the way, that Saturday is the most fun part, because these are amazing elite athletes who are good at compartmentalizing, right? And things like that, and still find a way to turn off that anxiety. But even those people, right, are not finding that much pleasure in this enterprise.
So we're at our hour, but I got to squeeze one more question in, because I would be absolutely remiss to not have you address this question. People listening will probably not be surprised, but you two call for the abolition of college football. And as I was reading that, I was thinking about, over the past 125 years, when university professors have tried to end football on their campuses, many, if not most, have been fired. I can think of, University of Chicago, very exceptional situation. Cal State Long Beach, also an exceptional situation, actually ended their football programs. So can you talk about, what does that mean? Abolition of college football, and what might it take for that to actually happen?
Let me just start, Derek. I want to hear. Okay, I'm not going to take I want to just maybe almost provide more context, and then you can get into the concrete. Because I think that the way we conceive it, we haven't had a chance in this conversation to get into, I think, just one aspect that is really an important part of our argument, which is that, we talk in the book about how college football occurs in a system of racial capitalism. Okay. And that's how we characterize structural coercion, okay? We're sort of saying that the entire system relies on the fact that historically, through its histories of slavery and Jim Crow and beyond, this has always been a profoundly racialized and discriminatory system of American capitalism that has produced classes that are not just classed in terms of like bourgeoisie, proletariat, the 1% and the 99%, but actually a racialized, like race and class map onto each other very neatly in the context of the United States because of the history of how race has been socially constructed in the United States, right? And how that has mapped onto slavery and the accumulation of value, such that Black Americans, not universally, okay, but Black Americans generally have been much worse resourced, okay, than white Americans and have not had the benefit of the accumulation of value over time as white Americans. Again, this is not a perfect generalization, but as a trend, it is certainly true. And this means that in terms of things like accessing higher education and all other sorts of forms of value, right, there are huge benefits to many white Americans versus Black Americans in terms of the opportunity to access what we would call predominantly white institutions that are the institutions where all the value is accrued in college football. It is very difficult to get into those schools, not because of the fundamental inherent aptitude of the human beings, but because of the social and economic environment human beings are raised in that opens and closes doors to them before they ever get to sort of realize their full abilities and selves. Okay. All right. That's the environment that college football takes place in. So for someone who is a racialized person who is having doors slammed in their face, if the one door that's being opened a little bit is the football door, that's the door that's going to allow you to kind of advance in the society that you're living in and have the opportunities that everyone wants, but are denied to you. Of course, you're going to open that football door. You're going to push it open, right? But to me, that's not a choice, okay? That's a form of coercion. That's the structural. The structure is saying you have to be a football player in order to have the life that you want to have. But perhaps if you had all doors open to you, you would choose a very different life, not the football life, okay? All right, I want to say this because then if we come to the question of abolishing football, what you might say reasonably to me is, well, listen, you've just told me that based on structural coercion, the organization of American society, this is one of the only sites of opportunity for many of the people in this society. If you just immediately eliminate this thing, first of all, the people have invested time and effort in, and also this is like genuinely one of their only or best opportunities. Aren't you actually hurting the very people you claim to be trying to help? Okay? And that is a perfectly legitimate question to ask. And that's why for us to make a claim like we want to abolish college football, we accompany in the book and just in general, we say, it has to be, if that were to happen, it would have to be associated with reparations, okay? The institutions that have accumulated all of this value based on this, what we would characterize as human sacrifice that is exploitative and produces all this value, you have to recompensate those people who have been harmed, the ones who have gone through the process, the ones who would currently be there, but also even the ones who are on that pathway already and made investments but maybe not got there yet. You have to compensate them for all the harm that they have achieved and produce the opportunities that were being denied previously. So what that really means is not just the reparation through the institutions that are benefiting from football, but it actually means that you can't really talk about abolishing college football without talking about reimagining American society more broadly, right? And so that's why for us, we would say Medicare for all. That's actually a college football issue, right? Because right now, people who are going through college football and having their bodies destroyed are then on the hook personally for all the costs down the line. But if you had a public healthcare system and you socialize that cost, then at least those folks would actually have the possibility of, right, of getting the care that they need and that they deserve. So all of the ways in which we can reimagine American society to make it more equitable, right? That is to say, bringing down the cost of university tuition. I mean, like free university, for instance, would be another way, would be maybe the best cure for structural coercion we could think of, right? Because if you could actually get in the door without having to worry that a scholarship is going to pay your way. And of course, everyone wants the scholarship to pay their way, right? Because if we're talking, Duke's cost of attendance is now $100,000 a year. Okay? No one who is not in the so-called 1% can afford to send their child to Duke University and not have a life of debt slavery, right? So that has to be, like, all of these aspects of our society have to be radically reimagined to then facilitate, I think, the abolition of college football in a way that is truly humane. And that is something that that's why we view this as somewhat fantastical as a goal, right? It's like an ethical vanishing point. It's an ideal, but we definitely are cognizant of the very practical constraints along the way.
Yeah, and Nathan has done a great job articulating how our book is actually not about college football. It's obviously in the title. The title of the book is The End of College Football. It's actually the end of racial capitalism, which is where our big adversary is with the structure that we've erected that makes college football coerces college football to look like this, to do this to people. So obviously that like college football is not going away. You're listening to students are going to be like, this is not going to happen. You're not going to abolish college football. So there's a layered argument there, and there has to be a layered argument short of abolishing college football. And I will add the small caveat that Nathan and I agree that tackle football generally should be abolished as a form of commodity spectacle, period, because of what we know about the harms, the long-term harms that necessitate someone playing as young as 5 years old, playing tackle football that cannot consent to that, life trajectory, that has no capacity. It's unethical to actually do that as an activity. Aside from that, college football is going to stay. Or at least I can't imagine a world in the next 10 years where college football is completely abolished. Short of that, there are things that we can do today that make the living and working conditions of athletes infinitely better, both now and in the long term. Of course, there are questions of reparations, there are questions of compensation, but there are things right now. Unionization, free healthcare, lifelong healthcare for anyone who has endured the system of harms, free lifelong tuition. So they don't have to go to school if they don't want to while they have that tuition for the rest of their lives. True say over their working conditions, actually a seat at the table in terms of creating and maintaining their health and safety standards. All of these things are incredibly important and could happen literally today with the amount of money flowing in the system that could have immeasurable positive effects on the lifelong social and mental and physical health of campus athletic workers. So we make both of those arguments. There's the big abstract abolish racial capitalism, abolish college football, but then there's also this like call to advocate for practical, pragmatic changes that are more aligned with a reformist logic, even though we despise the reformist logic that takes place in college football. We engage with it a little bit because there are things that can be done and should be done right now.
Well, you remind me of the revolution or reform. And the trouble with reformism, and this is actually the point we make in the last chapter of the textbook, the problem with reformism is that it wants to protect the system as it exists. And the goal is, we use the term we don't use the term revolution, transformation, right? The goal is to transform. And so what you're saying, and this brings us back to where we began about value neutral science and activist science, which is the world as it exists is not the world that we have to live in. The world as it exists was created, and that means it can be destroyed and recreated. And that's what you're talking about. And a set of reforms on a revolutionary trajectory can move us towards that revolution. Because what's impractical today, so the abolition is impractical today. You've said that. Fair. I think we can all agree on that. A set of reforms can change the world as it exists, and then what's revolutionary today might be a reform in the future, right? It becomes more practical. And this is what we teach in sociology, right? Which is why, we're not the most popular discipline with everybody these days. All right. Well, on that note, that's all the time we have for this episode. Derek, Nathan, thank you, first of all, for the incredible work you do. Thank you also for coming on our podcast, bringing your skill and knowledge from your own podcast to ours. Thank you so much for that. For folks listening, keep an eye out for our next exciting topical episode of the Sports and Society podcast. And you can always join the conversation on our Sports and Society's Discord server. An invite link is available in the episode description.